Picture a coastline that no longer exists. The year is approximately 16,000 years ago. The place is the edge of a landmass called Beringia, a vast, flat, treeless plain stretching between what is now Siberia and what is now Alaska, a land bridge approximately 1,000 kilometers wide from north to south that connected the Asian and North American continents during the height of the last ice age, when sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. This was not a narrow causeway or a temporary ford. This was a continent-sized piece of land, bigger than modern France, with its own ecology, its own weather patterns, its own animal communities. And on its southern coast, where the Bering Sea would eventually reclaim it, people were living, not passing through, not in the middle of some grand migration with a destination in mind. Living, hunting the marine mammals that congregated along the coastline, processing shellfish from the intertidal zones, using watercraft to move along the shore, doing what human communities have always done in productive coastal environments, which is finding that the productivity makes staying more attractive than moving. Some of those people at some point began moving eastward along the coast, not because they knew a continent lay ahead, not because they had a plan that we would recognize as exploration. Because the coastline continued, the marine resources continued, the logic of following productive coastal habitat continued, and the human tendency to push into unfamiliar territory when familiar territory is already occupied continued. And one day, though it was not experienced as one day, but as the accumulated directional drift of many generations of coastal movement, their descendants were in the Americas. This is the beginning of one of the most consequential migrations in human history. The colonization of the Americas represents the final major continental expansion of the human species. The last chapter of the story that began when anatomically modern humans left Africa and spread across Eurasia, island Southeast Asia, Sahul, and eventually, after a long pause in the cold refugium of Beringia, into two continents that had been entirely without human presence for the entire span of human evolution up to that point. How they got there, the routes, the timing, the technology, the ecological conditions, the specific populations involved, has been one of the most contested and most actively revised questions in all of paleoanthropology. The consensus picture that existed as recently as 30 years ago has been dismantled and rebuilt multiple times by new discoveries, new dating techniques, and ancient DNA analysis that has transformed understanding of population movements in ways that no previous method could approach. The current picture is more complex, more interesting, and more surprising than any previous version. Here is what we actually know, and how we know it. Start with the Bering Land Bridge, which remains central to the story even as the details around it have changed substantially. The land bridge was not a stable feature. It expanded and contracted with sea level changes driven by the waxing and waning of ice sheets across multiple glacial cycles. During peak glaciation, when the most water was locked in ice sheets and sea levels were lowest, Beringia was at its largest and most habitable. As glaciation reduced and sea levels rose, Beringia shrank and eventually submerged, with the final flooding of the land bridge occurring approximately 11,000 years ago. The human populations that eventually colonized the Americas are thought to have spent an extended period, possibly thousands of years, in Beringia or the adjacent region of northeastern Asia before their descendants moved into the Americas. This pause, sometimes called the Beringian standstill, is supported by genetic evidence from comparison of Native American genomes with Asian and Siberian populations. The genetic divergence between the ancestral population of Native Americans and their closest Asian relatives is greater than would be expected if the Americas had been colonized directly and rapidly from Asia without an intervening period of isolation and genetic drift. The standstill model suggests that the ancestral Native American population was separated from the main body of Asian populations, possibly by the formation of ice, sheets to their south that cut off Beringia from the rest of Asia, for a period that genetic estimates place at somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 years. During this separation, the isolated population accumulated the genetic distinctiveness that characterizes Native American ancestry relative to Asian ancestry. They were neither Asian nor American yet. They were Beringians, a distinct population developing in a specific place that is now underwater, leaving behind essentially no archaeological record because the sites they occupied are buried beneath the Bering and Chukchi seas. The eventual movement into the Americas, when it occurred, which route or routes it followed, and how fast it proceeded, is where the most active and most contentious current debate in American archaeology lives, and where the greatest number of surprises have emerged in the last 2 decades. The traditional model, which dominated American archaeology from the mid-20th century through approximately the 1990s, proposed that the Americas were first colonized approximately 13,000 years ago by people who entered through an ice-free corridor that opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as deglaciation began, moved southward through this corridor into the interior of North America, and spread rapidly across both continents within a few thousand years. This model was named the Clovis First model after the Clovis archaeological culture, characterized by distinctive fluted spear points, that was for decades the earliest firmly dated archaeological presence in North America. The Clovis First model was elegant, well supported by the available evidence, and widely accepted. It has also been progressively undermined and ultimately overturned by accumulating evidence that does not fit its timeline. The problem began with sites in South America. The Monte Verde site in southern Chile, excavated by Tom Dillehay beginning in the 1970s and ultimately dated to approximately 14,600 years ago, presented a well-documented human presence in South America that predates the Clovis culture in North America. If people were in southern Chile by 14,600 years ago, they could not have arrived via the ice-free corridor, which did not open until approximately 13,000 years ago and would not have been habitable enough to support a southward migration until somewhat later. Monte Verde was contested for years. The archaeological community was initially reluctant to accept dates that required abandoning the Clovis First model, and the site was subjected to intensive methodological scrutiny that ultimately confirmed its validity. Additional pre-Clovis sites have since been identified across North and South America, including Paisley Caves in Oregon with human coprolites dated to 14,300 years ago, the Buttermilk Creek complex in Texas with dates approaching 15,000 years before present, and several other sites whose dates, while sometimes disputed in detail, collectively paint a picture of human presence in the Americas substantially predating the opening of the ice-free corridor. The geographic distribution of pre-Clovis sites is particularly informative. Sites appear on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of North America, in the interior of the continent, and deep into South America, a distribution that suggests the initial colonization was not a simple linear progression from northwest to southeast following a single route, but something more complex involving multiple pathways and possibly multiple entry points. This geographic complexity, combined with the pre-Clovis timing, has elevated the coastal migration hypothesis from a minority position to a leading explanation for the initial peopling of the Americas. The coastal route model proposes that the earliest Americans did not enter through the interior ice-free corridor, but instead moved along the Pacific coastline, the Kelp Highway, as some researchers describe it, from northeastern Asia southward along the Alaskan and British Columbian coast, and eventually around into lower latitudes where the continental interior was accessible. The Kelp Highway concept refers to the productive marine ecology associated with the North Pacific kelp forests. Kelp forest ecosystems support extraordinary marine biodiversity: fish, shellfish, sea mammals, marine birds, in concentrations that would have provided coastal foragers with reliable, high-calorie food resources throughout the year. A coastal migration supported by kelp forest resources would not have required crossing the kind of sparse, harsh interior environments that characterized the ice-free corridor during initial deglaciation. It would instead have followed a productive marine habitat that extended from the Asian coast to the Americas in a nearly unbroken chain. The coastal route faced a specific geographic challenge during the glacial maximum. The coastline along much of Alaska and British Columbia was covered by glacial ice that extended to the ocean, creating ice walls rather than habitable shorelines for substantial stretches of the potential migration path. However, geological evidence indicates that ice-free refugia existed along this coastline even during peak glaciation. Sections of coast where the configuration of local topography, ocean currents, and ice dynamics maintained ice-free conditions even when surrounding areas were glaciated. The Haida-Gwaii archipelago off the northern British Columbia coast is one of the best documented of these potential refugia. The islands showed reduced glacial cover compared to the adjacent mainland, and their location at the intersection of warm Pacific currents and complex coastal topography created conditions where kelp forest productivity persisted even during glacial maximum conditions. Whether these refugia were actually inhabited by coastal migrants is not yet established by direct archaeological evidence. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The sites would now be submerged under sea levels that have risen significantly since the glacial maximum. But the ecological conditions were compatible with human occupation. The submerged coastline problem is one of the central challenges for testing the coastal migration model archaeologically. The coastline that would have been inhabited by coastal migrants during the glacial maximum is now anywhere from 20 to 100 meters below current sea level, depending on location and the specific timing of occupation. Archaeological sites on these submerged coastlines are not inaccessible in principle. Maritime archaeology has developed methods for identifying and excavating submerged sites in other contexts, but the scale of the area involved, the depth, and the challenges of submerged site identification make comprehensive survey essentially impossible with current technology and resources. The absence of direct archaeological evidence for coastal migration is therefore not strong negative evidence. It is the expected consequence of the sites being underwater and should be interpreted as absence of evidence rather than evidence of absence. Ancient DNA analysis has provided the most powerful recent tool for understanding American colonization, and the results it has produced have both clarified and complicated the picture simultaneously. Comprehensive genomic analysis of Native American populations compared with ancient and modern Asian and Siberian populations has produced several robust findings that constrain the possible colonization scenarios. All Native American populations share a single primary ancestral founding population, the Beringian population described earlier, whose descendants account for the vast majority of Native American ancestry across both continents. This finding supports a model of colonization from a single founding source rather than multiple independent migrations from different parts of Asia, and is consistent with the genetic bottleneck that would result from a small founding population expanding across two continents. However, within this overall pattern, the ancient DNA data reveals complexity that a single-wave colonization model cannot fully explain. Some Amazonian and other South American populations showed genetic signals that appear related to Southeast Asian and Australian populations, specifically to the Australasian genetic heritage associated with the Andamanese and related groups, rather than to the primary Northern Asian ancestry that characterizes most Native American populations. This Australasian signal, sometimes called Population Y, or the Anzic signal, after the context where it was first clearly identified, appears in specific geographic pockets and could reflect either a separate early migration from a different source population or a complex internal migration. Pattern within the Americas after initial colonization. The interpretation of these Australasian signals is actively debated. One hypothesis proposes a separate early maritime migration from Southeast Asia or Polynesia-adjacent regions that reached South America independently of the Beringian colonization. Another hypothesis proposes that the signal reflects the internal expansion of a founding Native American population that itself carried a component of ancient genetic diversity derived ultimately from populations with Australasian affinity through the complex population history of Eastern Asia. The data cannot yet definitively distinguish between these possibilities, and new ancient DNA samples from sites across both Americas are regularly adding information that shifts the probability balance between competing models. The Anzic-1 genome, extracted from the skeletal remains of a child found in Montana and dating to approximately 12,600 years ago, provided the first high-quality ancient genome from a Native American individual and confirmed that this individual was closely related to all modern Native American populations, supporting the single founding population model for most Native American ancestry. Subsequent ancient genomes from various North and South American sites have added resolution to the picture of how the founding population diversified and spread across the two continents after initial entry. The remarkable speed of the spread once it began is one of the aspects of American colonization that continues to astonish researchers. From the initial entry point, whether coastal or interior, the expansion of human populations to the southern tip of South America, approximately 15,000 kilometers from Beringia, occurred in a span of time that genetic and archaeological evidence constrains to perhaps a few thousand years. This is an extraordinarily rapid expansion for populations moving through entirely novel environments without any pre-existing knowledge of the terrain, the resources, or the ecological hazards. The speed is partly explained by the naivety of the prey animals. The Americas were, when humans arrived, populated by a diverse and abundant megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, glyptodonts, horses, camels, giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, that had evolved in the complete absence of human hunting pressure. These animals had no inherited behavioral wariness of human hunters, no evolved flight distance from bipedal primates with projectile weapons, no behavioral avoidance of the campsites and hunting approaches that humans used. The result was hunting success rates that would have been extraordinary by the standards of any other environment. A prey species that does not flee from an approaching hunter is a prey species that can be approached closely and killed with high efficiency. The initial wave of human hunters moving through the Americas would have encountered prey that simply did not understand what they were, and this ignorance was catastrophically lethal for the animals and enormously productive for the hunters. The rapid spread of efficient hunters through prey-rich environments with naive prey is a well-documented pattern in island colonization events. When humans reach islands, the island megafauna typically collapses within centuries because the same naive prey dynamics operate. The Americas represented this dynamic at continental scale, and the rapidity of human spread may have been driven in significant measure by the extraordinary hunting productivity of frontline populations encountering animals that had never learned to fear them. The contribution of human hunting to the late Pleistocene megafaunal extinction in the Americas, the disappearance of most large mammal species from both continents within a few thousand years of human arrival, is one of the most debated topics in American paleontology, and is relevant to understanding the colonization itself because the megafaunal extinctions provide an independent signal of the timing and geographic progression of human arrival. Sites with megafaunal remains disappear from the record in a geographic pattern broadly consistent with a human expansion front, moving from north to south, and the timing of local megafaunal extinction events in various regions aligns with the estimated timing of human arrival based on archaeological evidence. The technology that the earliest Americans brought with them reflects the sophisticated toolkit of people who had spent thousands of years in the demanding environments of northeastern Asia and Beringia. Hunting large dangerous prey with handheld spears requires close approach, which requires sophisticated understanding of prey behavior and reliable, effective weapon systems. The Clovis-fluted spear point, the technological hallmark of the culture that appears in the interior of North America approximately 13,000 years ago, is a sophisticated projectile technology whose fluting technique, while hotly debated in terms of function, required substantial skill to execute and produced a symmetrical, precisely formed point that attached reliably to four shafts. Pre-Clovis technologies, the tools used by the earlier coastal migrants if that model is correct, are less well characterized simply because the sites are either submerged, unidentified, or less well preserved. Where pre-Clovis tools are identified, they tend to be less standardized than Clovis technology, consistent with the toolkit of people adapting diverse technologies to diverse environments rather than a single highly refined technological tradition. The maritime technology question is critical for evaluating the coastal migration model, because coastal migration along the glacially active North Pacific coastline required watercraft capable of operating in challenging open water conditions. The same sea mammal hunting economy that coastal populations would have relied on for food during the migration required watercraft for effective access to marine prey. Skin boats, analogous to the umiaks and kayaks of historic Arctic peoples, represent a plausible technology for this context, using materials available in the coastal environment and providing the combination of seaworthiness, load capacity, and stability appropriate for coastal navigation in subarctic conditions. Direct evidence for watercraft technology at the relevant time period and in the relevant regions does not survive in the archaeological record. Organic materials decompose over 15,000 years in all but the most unusual preservation contexts. But the evidence for effective maritime capability in populations of comparable age in other contexts, specifically the colonization of Australia by anatomically modern humans approximately 65,000 years ago, which required open ocean crossings of at least 90 kilometers, demonstrates that watercraft technology was present in modern human populations long before the Americas were colonized. The question is not whether ancient humans had the technological capacity for coastal maritime migration. They demonstrably did. The question is whether the specific populations that colonized the Americas used that capacity in the specific context of the North Pacific coastal route, and this question is what the archaeological and genetic evidence is still actively resolving. What has become clear across the accumulation of 2 decades of new discoveries and new analytical methods is that the story of how humans reached America is substantially more complex, substantially earlier, and substantially more interesting than the clean Clovis first narrative that dominated thinking for most of the 20th century. People were in the Americas before the ice-free corridor opened. Some of them may have arrived by sea. Their descendants spread with extraordinary speed across 2 continents, encountering the most ecologically naive megafauna any human population had ever hunted, and left behind a record that archaeologists and geneticists are still learning to read. Multiple waves of subsequent migration, including the separate migrations that brought Na-Dene-speaking populations to the Pacific Northwest and Arctic-adapted populations to the far north, added further complexity to the population history of the Americas after the initial colonization. The coastline that does not exist anymore, the kelp-rich shores of a now submerged Beringia and the North Pacific coast, may hold the most critical evidence for answering the remaining questions. Someday, with better underwater archaeology technology and broader survey coverage, those submerged sites may be found and studied. Until then, the people who made that first crossing remain just beyond the visible edge of the archaeological record, moving along shores that the ocean has since reclaimed, carrying technologies we cannot yet recover, navigating an environment that no longer exists, heading toward a continent they did not know was waiting. They made it. That much is certain. 2 continents full of human civilizations, languages, technologies, and histories are the proof. The exact path they took is the part we are still working out. And honestly, given how much has changed in the last 30 years of research, the answer we have today is probably not the final one either.